as you all know, I'm Cassie Robinson, and yeah, it's really nice to be here. I don't know why I agreed to do this, but I did. And I'm also conscious, I don't know how many of you have travelled miles to get here, so I hope it's worth your while. So I'm just curious to start with, who in the audience has come here today because they always come to Creative Mornings?
Oh yeah.
Who's come here today because it's about sex? Who's come here today because they work around sex, intimacy, that kind of area? No one. Okay, that means I can say things that don't have to be true, and I've got no one like pulling me up on it. So I'm glad about that. So I'm really just going to sort of talk you through my journey, really, because I'm not here to sort of sell anything. I'm at the start of a new venture, which I will mention at the end, but I'm really, I'm just going to sort of talk you through my experiences. So I'm going to start with this book. Does anyone recognise or remember this book? I don't know what sort of ages we've got in the room. Yeah. So this was a book that Madonna published in 1992, I think, when I was 15, and my mum actually brought it for me, which was maybe a little bit strange, but my mum's a psychotherapist, or was, so I feel like that for some reason accounts for that. But this was really a really pivotal moment for me, because the book was quite controversial. You know, 20 odd years later, I'm not sure that, I'm not sort of saying I love Madonna now and everything she's done since, but at the time, for me at 15, it was a book that was just full of like diversity, boldness, creativity, experimentation. It really sort of brought to life the possibilities of what you could explore in terms of sex and sexuality. It also caused some really strong reactions with my friends, who were just like, oh, that's disgusting, and oh, that's outrageous. And I guess it really brought to life for me how difficult talking about sex can be, and all the complex feelings and emotions around it. But for me, it just really connected to my sense of like what's possible, and sort of creativity around that. And that was the sort of, I mean, not at 15, but sort of for the next 20 years, really, I feel like I've been on a kind of action research project around sex. And I don't mean action in the way you might imagine in this context. I guess I've always been like a little secret detective, doing some ethnography, going into different environments. Because for me, sex is something to be curious about. It's something that I guess in some way we all have in common. It's really a part of humanity. So I started going to kink nights. I just used to go on my own, which was great, really, because you could just be anything or anyone you wanted to be, have no sort of identity, and I'd just sort of walk around, probably being a bit of a voyeur. I'm not really sure if that's okay or not, but no one seemed to notice or mind. I went to a swingers club. I went to a dungeon. I went to something called a radical ecstasy workshop, which was looking at the relationship between spirituality and sort of bondage and sadomasochism. And then alongside sort of going off on these little road trips or field trips, I also started doing bits of work. I don't know how many of you have read my biography, and it's fine if you haven't, but my original sort of career started out in fashion and design. So actually I started doing a little bit of work with my business partner at the time for Coco de Mer, which I'm assuming people have heard of, the brilliant Sam Roddick. And we were designing bedroom uniforms. We did a 1950s catsuit that had a black resin butt plug attached to the end of the tail. But we were looking at sort of ways to bring sex toys into the clothing in hopefully a kind of stylish way. I was also involved in something called Sense and Sensuality, which actually didn't really take off, but was a brilliant guy called Charles who left the country, unfortunately. But this was a kit that I designed, which was around kind of spanking, tickling the senses, really, and exploring those. There also was a cafe in Covent Garden which closed down a few years ago called Coffee, Cake and Kink. I don't know how many of you have heard of that. But that was a place that I started running voluntary groups from. So twice a month I did one group for young women who were exploring their sexuality, and then I did another group for people to come to who wanted to explore, or who already were exploring different ways of being in relationships. So people were coming to that who were practicing polyamory or were interested in swinging or open relationships. And it was a discussion group really to explore those different aspects of relationships. Then I also started going to, this was all sort of at the same time in little parallel universes. Then I started going to I became more involved in the academic community as well, partly because in 2008 I started, I did an MSc part-time in applied positive psychology, and I wrote my final thesis on the relationship between sex and well-being, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But Oncenity is one example of an academic conference around sex and sexualities and gender and identity, which I went to. So I was sort of forming these different worlds, an academic one, a kind of field work, going out into the different spaces, and then, you know, running my own groups as well. So I was just building up this really rich and different, diverse picture of all kinds of topics around sex. And then I did a lot of reading. I actually got these out last night, so I was like, what am I going to show that's a bit more visual? And these were just some things off my bookshelf. I won't go through them all now, but they, you know, there's Radical Ecstasy book, there's one on intimate friendships, there's one on sex and aging, so sex through life, mindfulness and relationships. Anyway, I won't go through those anymore. So yeah, my thesis that I did for my psychology masters, I wanted to look at the relationship between eudaimonic well-being and sexual expression. And I guess I chose to do that because, having done all this kind of field work and ran some little research trips and stuff, I felt like there was something that was really missing, or not necessarily missing, but for me wasn't represented, which was this space that I felt was not, I'm actually just going to jump slides for a minute. It's kind of the space in between those two worlds, which is, on the one hand, you know, I was coming across lots of language and narrative and lots of communities that were thinking about the medical, the biological. Obviously things like sexual health is really important. But you know, there was a lot of talk of dysfunction, politics, gender, queer theory, all of that side of things. And then on the other side there was the performance stuff, the porn and burlesque, and, you know, the commodified, you know, all the new products and the sort of commodification of our sexuality. And then, you know, off on another little tangent, things like tantra. And none of those things are good or bad. Like, they all have a place, I guess, in the world. And lots of them I'm really interested in. But for me, there was this space in the middle, which I really wanted to explore. I'm going to go back. Which was eudaimonic well-being, which is, you know, how does your sexual expression link to things like your creativity, link to things like lifelong learning, link to, like, you thinking about it in terms of language that I don't think we often associate with sex. Unfortunately, these are just a bit too small. So I'm going to just read off. I mean, I kind of wanted to put a lot of words on the screen. I don't know if you can see any of them. But these are just some words that came out of my research when I did my thesis. This was the language that people were talking about. Nourishment, being undisguised, a complex exchange, vitality, come to life, dynamic, fluid, creates a masterpiece, full acceptance, centered. Those were some of the words. And then this is also talking about some of the benefits of it, enabling of risk-taking, a space to experiment, a will to live, wonderment, opening and releasing. I'm just going to leave those up for a few more seconds so you can all have a look. But for me, those kind of words were not words I was seeing enough around our sort of cultural narratives around sex. Which is why, yeah, that space in between is what I'm really interested in. And this is something I'm still exploring, really. This was my friend Catherine Angel, who I'm constantly having discussions with, who's helping me to get better at articulating what that space in the middle is. But this is just something she wrote for me, trying to help me explain things a bit better. Just leave that up for a minute. And so that leads on to something I've been doing for the last 18 months, which originally started off as being called Intimacy Lab. I actually wanted to call it the Sex Lab because I'm really conscious of the difference between intimacy and sex, and I think intimacy in some ways is even more interesting than sex, and of course intimacy can mean many things that are nothing to do with sex. So partly I actually wanted to sort of preserve the word intimacy, but unfortunately I wasn't allowed to use the word sex lab where I was holding these things. So it has got a bit confused, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do about that going forward. But the Intimacy Lab was something I first did. It's turned into Intimate Objects, but the Intimacy Lab was something I first did at the Barbican last summer. There was an event called Hack the Barbican, and I spent 2 evenings there, and we created, we had our own space for the whole 2 evenings, and basically set up a physical area which had 5 different aspects to it. One of which was we had a series of talks, and I tried really hard to make sure I didn't program any of the people I knew, even though they're very good, but that who would talk through those lenses that I mentioned earlier. And that was really hard to find, actually, people to speak about sex in that very specific way I feel quite strongly about. And we had an area where someone called Rachel Karazic created a dining experience where you either could eat with a stranger or you could eat with somebody you'd come along with. Then we had some whispering walls where we asked people questions and people whispered their answers into a secret post, but then the recordings were merged with everyone else's whispers and they became loops of kind of people's fantasies and secrets that you could listen back to. And we had 2 brilliant writers, Sarah Perry and Zoe Pilger, sit in the corner with typewriters for people to be able to go and confess to them things that they wanted to get out, their deepest, darkest secrets. And Zoe and Sarah would listen and type out in real time on their old-fashioned typewriters and then hand back to people just in a sealed envelope, something to take away with them, so it's not digital at all. And then we had another thing called Scales of Intimacy, where we had drawings done by an artist up in Scotland called Hannah Tulicki, where people could move figures on a screen into positions of intimacy. And obviously for some people that ranged to the very erotic, and for others it might have just been a touch on the shoulder or just a look from afar. But the sort of focal piece of the Intimacy Lab was an area where we had set up a kind of a design experience. People could sign up for a session, sit down with one of our team, and they were given a design brief, which they did either on their own, with some friends, with their partner or partners, and the idea was to imagine what kind of object they might want to design if they were thinking about their desires, their fantasies. And we very purposefully didn't start from the point of the object, but started much more from, you know, where do you like to be touched? What do you imagine when you're alone? What do you wish your partner knew about you? But big questions. And then we gave people modelling materials so they could, or drawing materials so they could basically design something. And then we also had a 3D printer there where we started to be able to 3D print some of the models that people were making. And that's basically, I think that, yeah. These are just some images from the Intimacy Lab that we did at the Barbican, and then we did one at the Royal Festival Hall in March as well. And the one at the Royal Festival Hall in March was just the 3D printing side of things. And that's kind of where I'm at. That sort of brings me to today, really, where we're in the process of setting up intimate objects as a sort of ongoing thing. We're going to be doing some more labs over the next few months. If you want to go on the site, there's nothing on there at the moment. There is a website for the Intimacy Lab. If you Google the Intimacy Lab, that will bring up some things. Intimate Objects just has a form where if you're interested in coming along to anything, then please do. And if you've got any feedback or anything else you want to kind of share with me, then please do. We're also doing a series of workshops over the summer on the future of sex. So we're going to be looking at the future of pornography, the future of sex and technology, the future of relationships. So again, if you're interested in any of those things, then message me and I can give you some details. But yeah, I suppose one of the other really important things I just want to say about what we're trying to do there is why I feel that this is a vehicle. So sort of having explained that space in between that I'm interested in, why we've sort of landed here with intimate objects is because, of course, I'm not that interested in making loads more objects in the world. But what I am interested in is the experience and the design process, the creative process you take people through for them to imagine what they might want to design. And if at the end of the experience they don't want to create an object, that's fine, because I believe that the value for them is in the journey that they go through. And I suppose that I really like that we're linking up more with the kind of maker movement and emerging technologies in that whole space, because you know, the values or the words that underpin that around experimentation, openness, play, adventure, curiosity, that feels to be the place that I want to sort of land with all of the sex and intimacy stuff. So that's me, that's the talk about sex. The thing I hope I can be a part of helping to create is a space and a language and a set of peers, if you like, who enable people to really connect with, I hate the word authentic, so it's really American, no offence to any American, but you know, with our sort of authentic sexuality, or our authentic, you know, and I'm a really big fan of technologies, so I don't want to sort of say that intimacy can't exist. Like, you know, technology gets in the way of intimacy. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it can do. But I'm interested in how technologies can potentially enhance it as well. But I suppose, if I sort of touch on the sort of more, you know, things like porn and young people watching porn, I don't want to basically just brush over all the stuff that I put in that right-hand column as if I'm living this big utopia and I don't understand the sort of issues that exist, because I do. And I know lots of really good people that are doing really good work in those areas. It's just not where I particularly want to focus, but I think young people watching porn is a really big challenge, and I think, I don't know how you can enable young people to think more authentically about their desires, you know, rather than what they think their desires should be. But I think that's one of the core issues around how people are developing their sense of sexual identity and their sexual expression now, is it's not really coming from them. But yeah, thank you for having me. And